Hong Kong protesters break the law. Hong Kong police vandalize a mosque just for fun. And tactics of nonviolent resistance. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News headlines. In Hong Kong, protesters once again took to the streets last weekend. Organizers say 350,000 marched, but because police did not give permission, it was technically an illegal rally.
That means anyone who come out will inherently break the law. So that's the tactic that the Hong Kong government is using. So don't think that the movement is slowing down. In fact, it is growing stronger and stronger. And if you pan the camera around, every single one of the protesters today standing here are literally breaking the law.
The march happened just days after a brutal attack on Jimmy Sham, head of the Civil Human Rights Front. They're an umbrella group that's organized some of the biggest rallies over the past few months. They also originally organized this Sunday's march, but backed out after police said no. But that didn't stop protesters from marching anyway. And that didn't stop police from responding with tear gas and water cannons, shooting blue dye laced with pepper spray. However, protesters did light a fire. And some did throw petrol bombs. But as for the barricades protesters erected, police now just drive through them. And they also decide to spray this mosque with water cannons, even though there weren't any protesters there, creating a mess that protesters then helped clean up. Hong Kong police later said that spraying the mosque with a water cannon was an accident. The kind of accident where they stopped the water cannon, carefully took aim, and then sprayed it several times. Hong Kong police successfully alienating every part of Hong Kong society. But it's not just police Hong Kong protesters need to worry about. On Saturday, a man stabbed a teenage protester in the neck and stomach. The protester had been handing out flyers. Okay, no one likes flyers, but that's taking it too far. It was so bad that the protester's intestines were exposed. He was taken to a hospital where he's in serious condition. So who was this guy? Apparently a cook from mainland China. After stabbing the protester, he threatened others, yelling that Hong Kong was a part of China. That's really not how a chef should be putting his knife skills to use. And coming up after the break, I sit down with a Hong Kong activist to talk about the tactics protesters are using in the face of this kind of brutality. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Joining me today is Hong Kong activist and board member of Amnesty International Hong Kong, Johnson Young. Johnson, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
So I've noticed that the Hong Kong protests have focused a lot on nonviolent tactics. Why is that?
Well, first of all, Hong Kong people are quite peaceful, and also nonviolent tactics can help us to galvanize international solidarity and support. We want to show that Hong Kong people has exhausted every means that we can under the rule of law to fight for our democracies and human rights. But it's quite obvious after 3 months of peaceful protests, after 1 million, 2 million people took the street, the Hong Kong government is still not compromising and not making any concession. And this brings a lot of hatred and also anger from the population. And most importantly, the police brutality that targets peaceful protesters has worsened the situation. That a lot of people now believe that that fighting back is the only options.
So do you think nonviolent tactics can work? Because it sounds like what you're saying is they haven't.
No, I think nonviolent tactics is really depending on the context. I still believe that nonviolent tactics will be useful to galvanize popular support and also galvanize international support. But keep in mind that right now, according to a lot of public survey, actually more than 75% of the Hong Kong people are approving the movement. So we have already achieved the goal of galvanizing popular support. And we have, so right now, I do think that in order to keep people on the street, in order to keep pressures over the government, then at least the protesters have to defend themselves with minimum of force. Now, I don't think anyone from the protester side would want to use force. But it's quite obvious that if the police was just tear gas or use baton to hit on protesters, there's no way the protester to use shield or to use wooden plate to protect themselves from the beatings of batons.
Well, in a leaderless protest like this, how do you enforce nonviolent tactics? I mean, I have seen more than a few Molotov cocktails thrown throughout the course of this.
So I would call it as a leaderful movement because I can see there are actually a lot of leaders who is running different fronts of tactics. There are people who is working on the international advocacy front. There are people who are gathering supplies that can provide supplies to the protesters. So I think this is like a leaderful movement rather than a leaderless movement. Now, the principles or you can say the culture of the movements was built within the movement. So back to June, there are people who suggest principles like we are not going to separate the moderate side or the radical sides of the protesters. We are going to protect each other. We need to prevent shedding blood on both sides. So these principles are in general agreed by the protesters. Now, there are, of course, in every movement, there are, of course, radical flank of people, but even people are throwing Molotov cocktail or fighting back to the police, there are people who will suggest that we shouldn't beat people indiscriminately. And these are the set of principles that are agreed by most of the protesters. And also the way, since there is no leading network or leading activist who is calling the shot, so most of the disciplines are enforced by the protesters who are on site. So there are, of course, some scenes which some protesters overreact. But the other protester will try to calm them down and de-escalate the situation. So these are the mechanisms that are enforced by individually, but not by hierarchies of organization. And to my observation, the movement is 100% largely nonviolent, and most of the disciplines are still maintained. And the force that is used by the protester are way lower than the level of force that is used by the police or state-hired thugs.
And I've noticed that humor and art has been a big part of the protest. What does that do?
Humor and art, it's really useful to maintain the momentums and also the morals of the protesters. Imagine that for 3 months, people are living in a very intense period. For people who are not even protesters, they are under threat of arbitrary arrest or intimidations by police. So having people who is playing music, who is dancing crazily, who is using those laser pen to point at some buildings, that is kind of the humor that people need because it helps to ease their very intense moment, and it keeps people to continue their participations in the movement. So that's the first benefit of having humor within the movement. And secondly, humor also, you can say, disarm the terrors of the government. So there are several examples. For example, the government were trying to outlaw the laser pen by claiming laser pen as a weapon, and they did arrest people for possessing laser pen. So the other night when the police arrest someone who is possessing a laser pen, people buy 1,000 more laser pen, and they had a music show with laser pen pointing in everywhere. So this disarmed the government terror, and it sent a very clear message saying we're not afraid of your arbitrary arrest. And since then, the government are reducing their numbers of arrests for people who are possessing a laser pen. So that's one example of how we can disarm the terror. One of the reasons why the umbrella movement failed in achieving substantial achievement is because we are heavily reliant on tactics of concentrations. meaning people occupying roads near to the government headquarters for 79 days. In the first 2 weeks of the umbrella movement, it was quite effective because the government didn't experience that mass numbers of people occupying main roads. But 2 weeks after, the government started to adapt these tactics and they know how to plan for counter mobilization and also counter tactics, which is to delay negotiations, and wait things out. And people learn from this experience that they are going to use more tactics of dispersions, meaning they are dispersing protests in different areas, using guerrilla protests in different areas. And it's very helpful in two senses. One, the police face larger barriers in arresting and rounding up protesters. And second, we bring police brutality and we bring the true colors of the police in front of different neighborhoods. So there are a lot of people who are not in the protest side. But when the police brutality, when the police is arresting people in different neighborhoods, people know the true natures of the regime and they become hardcore supporters of the movements. So it is really helpful for us to galvanize popular support. And when people, when residents in different neighborhoods, they were just having a dinners and get stopped and searched by the police, they would will resonate the cause of the movement, which is having an independent inquiry over police brutality.
So how do protesters learn about these tactics and how do they organize them?
So you can say most of the tactical or strategic discussions are done in Linden, which is like an online forum. People have a lot of discussions about what kind of strategy is the most effective. And the algorithms of this online forum, it has the provisions of a like and dislike button. And the algorithm also set in a way that the more popular threat it is, the more visible the threats are. So it becomes a de facto screening mechanism that the most popular strategy will be seen by most of the protesters. Now, we also have the Telegram channel, which will build on the foundation of the strategic discussions of Linden, the online forums, and then they would disseminate and coordinate tactics and actions and implementing those actions through Telegram. And then lastly, people will post a lot of pictures of police brutality, but also the bright side of the movement, like people helping each other, like and disseminate hope and message on social medias. So it becomes a feedback loop that helps us to snowball the movement. And that is the very reason why the movement has become so huge.
Now, I understand you were arrested during a protest. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So I was arrested late July. I was in Central and arrested by a group of police. At that time, I didn't do anything. I was sort of, following the instructions of the police, which is, stepping back. But still, the police arrest me for obstruction. And when I was arrested, I was punched by the police for several times. Nothing serious compared to other protesters who were beaten by batons and pepper spray. And then I spent 47 hours under detention. So during the detentions, the police were violating a lot of protocols. So, for example, I request calling my lawyers and calling my family members, and the police delay it, claiming that they have no capacity, claiming that I need to wait because there were so many people. And also, it's quite obvious the police were trying to take away my phone so that they can check the content inside the phone. And when, according to the procedures, they should put it in a sealed evidence bag. So no content, no information inside the phone will be contaminated. But when I request them to do so, I was surrounded by several police officers intimidating me, threatening to lock me in a so-called aircraft room. And by aircraft room, what the other police did to other protesters was they have buckets of cold water, pour it over the protesters, and lock him up in a very cold room as a way to torture people.
Yeah, this sounds more like torture than the rule of law?
It's cruel treatment to detainees. It's not the most serious torture compared to because we have report. Amnesty International also did a report on torturing case under detention. It interviewed more than 20 people. Over 85% of the detainees were hospitalized because they were beaten when they were arrested, and they were also beaten under detentions. There are multiple reports documenting fractures of bones or even broken bones because 4 police, 5 police were locking the detainees in a rooms and then they beat him up. So it has become a phenomenon that the police would use cruel treatments on detainees. So luckily in my case, I didn't experience that. And I think part of the reason is because I know the procedures and the lawyers also keep a close eyes on me. But I was threatened verbally when I was detained. So during those 47 hours of detentions, my house was also searched, which is something that is uncommon because I was arrested for a very mild crime. But the police, I think they tell lies to the judge and claim I was involved in illegal assembly. And the judge signed a warrant for house search.
And what was your charge?
My charge was I was arrested for obstructing a police officer. Okay. But when the police applied for a search warrant, they claim I was involved in illegal assembly. And that's the reason why the judge signed the warrant to the police. And I was arrested along with 48 people. All of them get a house search. And they did a house search at 10 or even midnight. So it is an intimidation to not just the detainees, but also the family members of detainees. So imagine that the detainees were handcuffed and put a chain on him. And they were taken to their home to do a house search. So it is a humiliation, it's an intimidation to family members. And that's how we were locked up in the 47 in those 47 hours. We were also detained in a car park. Turns into so we were locked in a police station car park. Turned into a temporary detention center. Wow. There's no good ventilation in there, so it was really hot. It was like 32 degrees Celsius, and there was no place for us to sleep. So some people have to lie on the floor. I also witnessed that some protesters and detainees were beaten in the head and they were bleeding, and they were not allowed to send to the hospital 4 hours or even 5 hours after they were beaten by the police. So there are, it's evidently that the police deprived the rights of medical assistance of detainees as well.
And you said you received verbal threats. What kind of threats?
So when I request the police to seal my phone because I don't want them to take away my phone and contaminate it, I was surrounded by several police officers. They were yelling at me, and one of the police officers took his torchlight and pointed to my eyes. So those are the kinds of verbal abuses I experienced. They also threatened me to lock me in an aircon room. They threatened saying, using, they swear at me, claiming at me as a flu. So those are the verbal abuse I experienced.
What do you think is motivating police officers to behave the way they behave?
The police are generally hostile to the detainees and also the protesters. According to the procedure, I was a suspect, so they can go through the procedures, take a photos, gather evidence. That's all right. But it's quite obvious that the police officer enjoy verbal abuse or even torturing detainees. And I think it is, there are several reasons why it motivates the police to torture people. First, there is no scrutiny. Supervisor allows them to do so. And second, they hate protester because protester always confront the police because the protester, they want to express their anger to their government. But the government officials were hiding behind the police. And that's why the police feel they are disrespect and they want to retaliate on the protesters.
So where do you think the protests will go from here?
So a lot of people seeing the October 1st as endgame because it is the 70th anniversary of the PRC. But I think the protest wave will not go away, and there are several reasons. One, the government is not willing to make any concessions. Although the Carrie Lam withdrew the controversial extradition bill, what we experienced in the past 120 days is police brutality. And we also experienced the bad consequences of lacking a checks and balance system. It is the system that enable police to beat people indiscriminately and arrest people arbitrarily. And what we want is a systematic change because removing one bill is not going to prevent further police brutality in the future. So during the first dialogue of Carrie Lam with some of the citizens, she explicitly saying she cannot open an independent inquiry over police brutality. And without satisfying this demand, the protest wave is not going away. And secondly, more than 75% of the population disapprove the government. Almost half of the population have zero trust to the police and also the government. With such a contentious environment in Hong Kong, a lot of protests will happen or will be triggers in the futures. So even the government would employ massive arrests on protesters, more will come. But the sad part of things is, I do believe that the Chinese government is going to tighten the grips over civil societies of Hong Kong because they see Hong Kong as a threat to the legitimacies and also stability of mainland China. So journalists will be intimidated, critical scholars will be dismissed, more corporations will be intimidated and they will be forced and asked to dismiss workers who participate in strikes. So in a short one, the Hong Kong civil society will experience a crackdown. But I guess in the long one, because so many people are not trusting the government and so many people are angry to the government, in the long one, the Hong Kong society will continue to fight against the Hong Kong government and also the Chinese government.
So you think you'll succeed?
I think we will succeed in the long one, but there are also several conditions. First, the global international community will have to stand up against the Chinese government. Second, we have to make more allies to most of the liberal democracies and also our neighborhood countries, because we are also under bullying of the Chinese government. And thirdly, we will need to preserve as many human resources as we can. We need to preserve as many activists as we can. That's why we need to build a very strong support network, lawyers network, a medical network to support those who are under imminent threat of the government. If we achieve this, if we succeed in maintaining this condition, then I think we will win in the long run, because there are so many problems in China. At this moment, the state power of this authoritarian regime is strong, but it cannot maintain its state power forever. There are so many internal contradictions in mainland China society as well, like a widening wealth gap, like the young people are also they also have a lot of grievances because they cannot climb up to the social ladders and get a house for themselves. So this kind of internal contradiction would backfire to the Chinese government. And if Hong Kong and also other international community manage to survive, then there will be a lot of opportunities for us to win.
So there's certainly a lot that governments around the world can do. But what can people watching this interview, what can they do?
In the past few months, Hong Kong movement strategy have been focusing on galvanizing international support. And there are several ways that individuals can help, like passing legislations and policy in your own government to deter police violence. So for example, in the US, we have been trying to get the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to pass because it could deter police brutality by threatening revoking the special trade status of Hong Kong. And also the US government and also the EU or even Australia, they can consider sanctions individual officers or police commissioners who enable police violence against peaceful citizens. So as an individual, you can call your representatives, you can tell your representatives that in order to not just help Hong Kong people, in order to safeguard democracies and the way of life of democratic institutions, their government should stand up against the Chinese government and Chinese authoritarian regimes. So that's one way people can help. Secondly, show solidarity to Hong Kong people and also people who are oppressed by the Chinese government, like Tibetans and Uyghurs, because Hong Kong people are morale will need to be maintained if we want to survive the long run oppressions. So having foreigners, having people from around the world to share news of Hong Kong, to show up to protest, it will help maintain our morale of the movement. And thirdly, enhance citizen-to-citizens exchange and solidarity is also very important, because what we are talking in here is we need innovative way, we need innovative tactics to continue our struggle. And in order to keep our mind fresh and innovated, we have to learn from other country examples. So having this kind of citizen-to-citizens exchange and solidarity will help us to keep our action more diversified. And that's the way that we can win.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Stay safe out there.
Thank you.